So, an inclusive liturgy all week long. In the last decade, we've begun to hear a lot about the ways that congregations have begun to welcome and include people in sanctuaries that are accessible and more inclusive worship. There's been all kinds of creativity involved. Barb Newman is one of those around inclusive worship, and if you haven't heard this already, at the CLC network table, thanks to the Calvin Institutes for Christian Worship, you are all entitled to a free copy of her book on accessible worship and gospel. So stop by and pick yours up. And thank the Calvin Institute for that as well. But there are all kinds of creative things that have begun to happen. People like Ann Masters at Newark are getting the people in the psych departments who do ABA to talk to people who are doing liturgy and marrying ABA and faith development and two languages and systems that would have never talked to each other 10 years ago. We're learning how to use all the senses in worship to communicate with people who communicate in ways other than the heard, spoken, and sitting down word. There are creative alternative worship services like Rejoicing Spirits, the Parables model, no shush services, which in fact are not so much segregated events as an alternative form of worship to which everybody can come, and especially if they're held on Sunday mornings or Saturdays along kind of with the other flow, it's just an alternative form. And people who run those services say, oh, other people begin to stop by and say, this looks like a lot of fun. Maybe we'd like to be part of this as well. Clergy are learning to adapt, to bless, and to lead, finally. And I'm a clergyman. By adapt, I mean being open to change and adapt to unusual or unexpected things happening in a service, as Eric mentioned. By bless, I mean realize the importance of congregations doing this, but not feel like they have to be the ones doing it, and those who want to, all they need to do is to bless that work publicly and help it to go. And by lead, using the authority of their position to speak from the pulpit, to preach, to proclaim, and in other ways to empower the initiatives in those congregations. I think all of us are hearing stories of congregations who are attributing both their growth in numbers and spirit to their inclusive work and work on inclusion. And that inclusion practices, lots of people are saying what you all and I have known for a long time, oh, this is good for everybody. This is good for everybody. Some of the things that I've written about in the past that I thought of as sort of biblical themes bubbling up from this, you're beginning to see them. People practicing the ancient art of hospitality in new ways. People being re-membered into the body of God's people, however we define that. Sanctuaries becoming safe places rather than scary places, especially for people with mental illness and other kinds of hidden disabilities. And learning new perspectives to recognize that everybody's got gifts and that people can be called to use them in service to others. That's not uniform, you know it's not. But there's been a lot of good work and hard work being done in this, and you are the laborers in the field. You are the ones who've been helping this to happen. But Jackie Fertile Mills last year at an event sat down with me for a few minutes, and Jackie is the leader of the McLean Bible Church extensive ministry, especially known in the evangelical world in the Washington, D.C. area. Their accessibility summit draws about 600 every year. But she sat down with me and said, Bill, now what? Now what? You know, a lot of these good things are happening. Now what? What's the next frontier? And to start with a kind of answer to that question, let me say, what do you as a people usually expect and want from worship? From gathering together to pray, to praise, to ponder, to preach, to confess, to share, to bless, and more. I'll give you a hint. My pastor in high school ended every service by saying, right before the benediction, the worship is over, the service is about to begin. The worship is over, the service is about to begin. The answers to now what are what difference does our worship make to our lives and the impact on the rest of our week, the life in our faith community, the life in our communities and in the broader community and world. In our far too workaholic world and in the Christian tradition, James says it most basically, faith without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. The workaholics need to know, on the other hand, that it's not the way to salvation, but they're not. But that's to me. So now what? Now what? Start with your congregational home. How are the people there being welcomed, people with disabilities, and included by being asked, invited, and given a chance to serve in the life of their community? Everybody's got a gift and a talent. It matters not how many. It matters not. What matters is whether there's a chance for them to use them in offering to others. People want a chance to give as well as to receive, to be a follower, a doer of the word and not a hearer only. My singing is terrible. A servant, a disciple, however you name it. Truth to be told, it's a lot easier to give for most of us than it is to receive, especially if you have to ask. Especially if you have to ask. My first teacher was a woman named Kathy. Cerebral palsy, had grown up at the institution where I was first Protestant chaplain. 1979, my first conference on inclusive ministries. We got her to tell her story. She got to the end of her story in her shaky voice. She said, it's really important for you to be nice to handicapped people, but it's more important for you to let them be nice to you. It's more important for you to let them be nice to you. And if we can't do that in our congregations, it says more about our creativity and imagination than it does their skills. Hear that clearly. If we can't do that, it says more about our lack of imagination and creativity than it does our skills. In fact, being able to do something to help out in some way may be the ticket in. If you've read Emily Colson's book, Dancing with Max, you know how Max, her son with autism, got into his congregation. They had been felt excluded for years. She finally got sick of that and said, we've got to start going. And they started using the best of autism training techniques and started doing backward chaining. So they went at the benediction. And then the next Sunday you go a little bit earlier. The next Sunday you go a little bit early in the service. So you don't come at the beginning and have to leave in the middle of things. You come near the end and build up the capacity to do that. Backward chaining. First Sunday they went, they got there. And right after that, the guys who were called the grunt crew were picking up the folding chairs and stacking them up. The grunt crew called over to Max and said, hey, you want to help? And Max can stack chairs. And Max became a member of the grunt crew. And they became his team that championshiped his membership and his involvement in that congregation. You do something, get people to see them acting out their faith is the ticket into people saying, by golly, these folks have got something to contribute here in the life of our community. You might say, well, not everybody has these skills, but think of the hundreds of simple tasks that make up the lifeblood of any congregation, and the possibility even of learning to do one with a mentor or partner, if you wanted to do that together, which could also become a path to relationship and friendship, a la Eric. It could be known and seen as turn that pledge of inclusion into a joint offering to the wider community, into that community of faith, of people offering together. Take it further, inclusive liturgy, prayer, praise, preach. We did not collude on this, but as I wrote a couple of last week, as the Black Church names it, call and response. What does liturgy even mean? What does liturgy even mean? Do you know what the Latin root is? It's the work of God's people, the work of God's people. Our work in worship and community leads to commitment to live out our faith the rest of the week through our jobs, volunteering, parenting, you name it. So what's the next thing we could do? We can prepare a way, make the path straight, lower the mountains and the barriers so that people with disabilities can find smoother ways to live out their true sense of calling, vocation, and contribution. Translated into secular talk, we can help them get a job. We can help them get a job. Finding a job has certainly been an experience of wandering through the desert for people with this, for the 75% of people with disabilities who are usually unemployed in this country, and a higher percentage, as Eric said, for people with intellectual disabilities. And there's all kinds of biblical texts to back that up. I'm not going to do that kind of eisegesis this morning. I've got some written here, but I want to keep on. The Psalms, other places talk about the praise of the work of our hands, the call for us to care for the earth, to take care of ourselves, to work for our own food, the blessings of work. There are all kinds of biblical places. And for you, Darla, the Buddhist statement that our work is to discover our work and then to give our heart to it. The work is to discover our work and to give our heart to it. Work is a way of living out one's faith and call and one's responsibility to care for the created world and for one's life. Call on the one hand, obligation and responsibility on the other. We talk about it a lot in our time as both the secular and religious world seem to worship at the feet of finding a sense of purpose. And a sense of purpose is really, I think, one of the key things about what it is to live a spiritual life. Rick Warren made millions off of it, a purposeful life. But corporate people pay people other millions to help them find it as a sense of corporate mission and in business. But the best statement I think about purpose is, Frederick Buechner's wonderful saying, the place God calls you is the place to where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. The place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meets. Many congregations already do this. There are national employment ministries that have worked with individual congregations. A bunch of them sprung up during the last recession in 2007, 2008, because lots of typical people were out of work, and people used congregations as ways to network with one another and help people keep themselves through that journey and find other kinds of places. When we do mission work in other countries, much of that mission work is often around employment development and helping people start new vocations or new businesses, even with a flock of goats or get my herds and stuff and goat flocks right. But you know what I mean, a flock of chickens. And the one thing we can do in all those employment initiatives already going on is to encourage them to include people with disabilities, because they've never made that imaginative break to think, people with disabilities face the same issues, and we could use these same kinds of skills. They've not been usually included. Why? Because the faith community has caught the sickness of so much of public services. The tendency for programs to develop that focus on needs and deficits primarily to become standalone silos where they don't talk to one another. So the disability folks don't talk to the employment folks, who don't talk to the elderly folks, who don't talk to the health folks, who don't talk to the housing folks. And by golly, one thing congregations can do is drive around silos. You can drive around silos. You do not have to ask for permission. You can ask some government agency later for forgiveness if you need to, but you don't have to ask for permission. So how again might that look? Think of the possibilities. Think about the 75% of people who are unemployed who may be within the orbit of your congregation. Think about what your congregation has. One of the magic things about congregations is that you drop a specific need for a specific person in the middle of a group of 10 people, and magic happens. Because people will not let that need go unanswered in some way or some dream. Because people begin a relationship, they hear the call, and they know they can respond, and they'll do something about that. We do it in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of circles in our congregational life already. What else do congregations have? Congregations have people with all kinds of collars. There are priestly collars, but they're blue collars, and they're white collars, and they're dirty collars, and they're no collars at all. Who are those people? They're employers, employees, members of voluntary clubs, organizations, service groups, and more. The research is done, and you may know this, that some huge percentage of voluntary giving and voluntary leadership in any community comes from people in the faith communities. Huge percentage of that. In a congregation within 6 degrees of separation, you know the whole world. And if you don't know the whole world, you at least know everybody in your county or town within a couple of degrees of separation. So think about the possibilities. Think about one of those 75% of people who are unemployed who might come within your orbit. Perhaps they've become part of your community and they've not only attended but begun to feel that they really belong in that community. And people have gotten to know them and they see them living out their faith and their desire to live a life of faith. And then someone says to them, what else could we do? And they talk to them directly instead of telling them what we can do for you. They ask, what do you do during the week? What do you like to do? What could we help you do? Do you want to work? Have you tried to work? Find a job. Be prepared for what you might hear and be willing to hear that story. But better yet, tell that story to a small group of people within that congregation. And maybe a small group who's even gotten thought together about a process for listening to those needs and dreams and figuring out some person-centered kinds of plans and ways of thinking about that, about what this person might kind of job, what kind of thing they might be able to do with the gifts they have, and start dreaming and brainstorming. What skills and interests? Who also got those in this congregation? Where might they fit in? Who might use them? And if we don't know, we know the rest of the people in this congregation. Every one of those people might know somebody who knows something about this and likes to do the same thing. 6 degrees of separation. So think about how this might work. You know Bill. We in our congregation, we've been looking for ways in some place in the community where he could use the fact that he loves to garden and loves to work in the dirt. Now, you might not think he likes to get dirty, because sometimes obsessive compulsive people don't like to get dirty. He's on the spectrum. I'm talking about me, partly about this, but sort of playing with that. And sometimes people on the spectrum are very particular, but he likes to take care of the church grounds. He shows up for every time the church asks for people to help clean up the grounds. He hates weeds, loves to see plants in order and pretty. Who do you know? Help us think about somebody who, what do you have an idea? Can you help us? If you know some people who do stuff like that in the community, do you know them? Could you help us make an introduction? If you know them personally, could we do a personal introduction? And could we help them get to know Bill and say, here's a guy who loves to do this kind of stuff. Would you guys possibly give him a volunteering role or work with him or an internship? Or by golly, he might even be able to do something that you've been looking for. And we guarantee you he would put his heart, mind, and soul into it. And thereby you're using the most prevalent way that people get jobs in our society, which is networking through other people. It's not through the monster job site. It's not through want ads. The most prevalent way is networking. And who do you know who knows? And the most prevalent way. Or it's not Bill, it's Jane. She grew up in this congregation. Everybody knows her accomplishments. We've known her for years. We've celebrated her Special Olympics accomplishments. She's turning 21, aging out of school, and all of a sudden there's nothing for her to do. But we know the kinds of things she can do and all the kinds of interests we have. She's an artist. She'd love to do something in the area of art, maybe even start her own business. And we hear that there's some kinds of things called micro-enterprises where people with disabilities start their own business. In fact, talk to the Mennonites. They've got a book the story about one where a congregation helped an artist to run that kind of business. And it's in the book that's in the display outside. Or the young man in Chicago who opened his own photography studio. Or you may have seen on national TV or the news or Facebook, the guy named Ted who opened his own coffee shop, a guy with Down syndrome who opened his own coffee shop. He just closed it recently because another higher priority came along. He decided to get married. But he's going to move somewhere and probably start up a new one. I don't think he's going to give up work, especially you have to pay for being married. Or maybe it's Joe. And Joe is a guy who went to Afghanistan 3 times. And we prayed for him and his family. On the last time, they hit an IED. He's now an amputee. He's coming back and doesn't know what he's going to do. And if you know employers, they say they support veterans, but they don't give them jobs. That's a fact in our society. It's just like Bruce Springsteen said, you think we take care of our own, we really don't. And think about what this congregation could do with Joe and who we might be able to work with Joe and help how we could help them find. And as you get into this, Bill, Jane, and Joe all of a sudden begin to say, I may not be getting a job real quickly, but I really appreciate the moral and emotional support that you're giving to me. I don't feel so alone, like I'm not looking by myself. I don't feel like I'm just looking through a wilderness. And that just really means a lot. And then somebody in the congregation says, well, what are you doing? Is this some kind of crazy liberal social justice ministry? And you say to them, yes, it is. And somebody who comes out of social justice and says, you're making this person get a job and pay for their own responsibility. Is this some kind of crazy right-wing ministry? And you say, yes, it is. It's both. It's not either or. And politically, it works both sides of the spectrum just perfectly. Just like the Bible says it's not an either or, it's a both and. And why can't we get our act together and beyond those divides and do something together that really embodies what we believe? And moreover, in the Bible, there's an amazing injunction to most employers of their day who happen to be farmers. One might even call it a divine administrative order, an unfunded mandate that was never voted on and reads like this. When you reap your harvest in the field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, do not go back for it shall be for the stranger, for the orphan and for the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive tree, you shall not go over the boughs again, for it shall be for the alien, the orphan, and for the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not go over it again. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, for the widow. An agrarian society, don't harvest it all and give it to those poor people. Give them a place to work for their own food and to gather their own harvest. And the dignity of that kind of work to do that. In our economy, it's a very different economy. But what if every employer who considered themselves a person of faith and wanted their business to serve a wider public and community purpose committed 10% of their business to carving out roles for people with disabilities or other people on the margins. And I could have other people help them figure out how people could do jobs in their businesses, not as a charity, but because they'd be damn good employees. And they'd be loyal to the company. They would help, as the research serves, the whole morale of the team and contribute overall to the life of those companies as well as to their bottom line. If it fits the biblical mission, it can fit a corporate mission. Then the horrible unemployment numbers would go down. People of faith would have pulled off what 40 years of taxpayer-funded employment services have not been able to do. Some might call that a modern-day miracle, as well it would be, as well as a tikkun olam, a healing of the breach, a repairing of the gap. People who were stigmatized and marginalized in the past would have been called off of their involuntary roadside perches, watching the world go by, and included not only in the temple, but then become faithful followers and citizens and workers. And they might even have the chance to become addicted to work like the rest of us. Or they might help us teach a different way. That, my friends, has been the vision and the results of a project called Putting Faith to Work that we've been working on for the last 3 years in 4 states. It's where there's going to be a record of this work in an online free manual coming out this summer, available for any congregation to take and customize and use it as they wish. It's not perfect. It doesn't work like clockwork. Tell me any organizational thing that does work like clockwork, or especially any congregational thing that works like clockwork. Congregations have their own time, and that depends upon, and John can tell us more about that when he speaks in a little bit here in just a second. But what it does take are people willing to speak to people who have those needs, walk with them on the journey, shared creativity, commitment, connections, and faith to get the job done. The fact that our project has only worked with a limited number of congregations in a limited number of states with varying success, you might say, oh, that's not going to work. But think of all that 355,000 other congregations. There are a lot of people out there who could take what we've done and do it a whole lot better. And that's the general idea. Think what we could learn by that kind of initiative. Don't be daunted. It's a huge task. But there's a wonderful saying from the Talmud, don't be daunted by the grief, the enormity of the world's grief. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. You're not you're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Neither are you free to abandon it. And that indeed could be the work of God's people. A liturgy all week long. The benedictions would be fantastic. Thank you. And